Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 cheap board games. These are economical options for those of you who want to buy board games but do not want to spend too much. So that's pretty much it. Games that cost, roughly speaking, around $25 or less will qualify for this list. So let's get straight to my number 10. My number 10 cheap board game is Bonanza the Duel, designed by Uwe Rosenberg. And this is a two-player only iteration of the classic Bonanza that was designed originally 20 years before this one came out. Now, Bonanza is a popular, lighthearted game with caricatures of beans on it that players are planting and trading. But the cool thing about Bonanza is the mechanism with the hand order. You cannot change your hand order. Your cards have to be played exactly in the order that you draw them. Now, that sounds very limiting, but the challenge around that is engage in trades and negotiations with other players around the table in order to get rid of cards that are in between or in the way of the other cards that you're more interested in laying down and planting. And based on certain sets, depending on the value of the bean, you turn them in and you score a certain amount of points or coins, and that's your victory points at the end of the game. Now, this game here basically confines it to a two-player only experience, but it is much superior to the two-player version that's found in the original rules of Bonanza, because here they find a way to compensate for the fact that there's not going to be any trading. Trading in its natural sense cannot take place between two players who are trying to dominate one another. You need that third party or fourth party, or in some cases 5 or 6 players, in order to really spice things up for a trade. What it does, though, it replaces that trade phase of Bonanza with a gift phase in which players play a little bit of a tug of war, where you offer a player a bean card, and they choose whether or not to accept the bean card you offered. And again, they're mandated to plant that bean right then and there, and they may not have the space for it. But if they choose not to accept it, instead, they have to make a counter offer. They have to offer you one of their beans. And the bean that they offer you cannot be the same type that you've offered them, or any of the beans that have been offered previously during that particular gift phase. And eventually, a player has to bite, and they either have to end up taking a card that they do not want, or they decide to bluff and offer a card that they know that their opponent would hate and has no use for, although that player doesn't even have that card to begin with. So they're pretending to have the card that they're offering, but they don't really, in hopes that their opponent turns it down. But if their opponent decides to call their bluff, then they're going to have to pay a 1 coin penalty, which means they lose 1 coin and their opponent gains 1 coin, which is a 2-point differential, which in a low-scoring game makes a huge difference. But this small little box packs quite a big punch. I would say that this is the best iteration of Bonanza out there, Bonanza the Duel. And now we move on to my number 9 cheap board game out there, and that is Paperback. And Paperback is basically Scrabble meets deck building. This is a word construction, word building game where players are drafting cards or purchasing cards to grow their deck of letter cards. And there's different types of letters. You have single letters, you have 2 letters put together, and you have a bunch of different letters of different values on the trade row. And there's always 2 available for each value for you to purchase. But in order to purchase it, you have to build word cards. And you're building these word cards or words, actual words, and letter by letter. And only the letters you actually use from your current hand are going to score you money for that round. And then in turn, you're going to use that money to either buy more letter cards or to purchase your fame points, which is how you win the game. This game is really cool, really neat. Also, each of the cards, or many of the cards, have special abilities that are really cool and really neat. However, you cannot trigger those abilities unless, again, you use those cards for the construction of a word. If you're not able to construct a word with those cards, then you're not going to grant their point. You're not going to get their point. So sometimes you find yourself in a predicament where you choose to construct a word that perhaps will not get you as much money, but it might utilize a letter that will trigger a really neat action that will benefit you either then or perhaps on the next turn. Really cool, really neat. If you like word building at all, and you also like deck building, this game is a must-have for your collection. My number 9 cheap board game, Paperback. And now we move on to my number 8. And my number 8 is Hero Realms, the deck building game. And this basically is a reiteration of Star Realms, but with a fantasy theme. Star Realms originally, a few years before this, came out with a space exploration science fiction theme. Hero Realms here has the classic fantastical tropes of different fantastical creatures and heroes, but it's basically the same thing as Star Realms in the base game, where 2 players are going at it toe-to-toe, trying to defeat or eliminate all of their power in order to eliminate them and defeat them. So it's a very cutthroat game in that regard. You're not simply just trying to accrue points, you're trying to demolish your opposition. Now, the reason why I have this number 8 is because if you're just factoring the base game alone, then it does not warrant me putting it any higher than number 8. And technically, for it to qualify for the list, it has to be the base game alone, because that's what makes this game cheap. The fact that you're only buying the base game, and the base game costs less than $10. It's around the $15 to $17 range. However, if you want to invest very economically and little by little in these hero packs, and there's 5 different hero packs, and they cost about $8-9. These hero packs basically make every player a little bit different. They give them a starting deck that's unique to him or to her, based on their starting class. Ranger, a thief, you got a wizard, a fighter, a cleric, and they have some unique items to start the game off with based on that class of theirs. But even more neat, if you decide to invest a little bit more money, and again, it's still economical, you can buy the Ruin of Thandar campaign deck here. And basically it turns Hero Realms into a cooperative campaign play where all the players are actually on the same side competing against the Overlord, the bad guy, and all of their minions. And it becomes story-oriented. The book comes with not only a rule book, but a little bit of a quest book, which has scenario by scenario and some narrative to gel and weave all of those stories and scenarios together into one masterpiece. And there's even a sequel, The Lost Village. I don't have that. The Lost Village campaign deck, which continues basically where you left off from here. So if you want to make it cooperative, you want to make it campaign oriented, you make a few more of these still relatively economical investments and purchases, and all of a sudden this game blows up. But I cannot consider that, because I'm just considering the base game. I'm going to have to give it number 8, but you have to start somewhere, folks. My number 8 cheap board game of all time, Hero Realms. And now we move on to my number 7. And my number 7 is The Castles of Burgundy, the card game. I am a huge fan of The Castles of Burgundy, the board game. And that game is not cheap. It's pretty economical for what it brings. I think for the most part you could get it in the mid 30s, maybe early 40s. But this game here is a condensed version of Castles of Burgundy in the form of cards. So it kind of recreates the dice rolling mechanism of Castles of Burgundy, where you roll dice and the pip values determine what actions you can do. Here, the cards themselves are the dice. So each card has a die value printed on it, a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4, or 5, or a 6. And you're going to be flipping over these cards and using these cards as randomizers to determine what actions you can trigger. Now, this is going to keep it more controlled. It's obviously not going to be as chaotic as dice rolling can be, where you roll the same numbers over and over again sometimes. Here, you're going to have that variety, that difference. So there is that advantage. But it does strip the game down of some of the neater aspects of it. So I'm nowhere close to trying to say that this is a replacement for Castles of Burgundy or that it's superior. But it's a good way of getting your Castles of Burgundy fix in a quicker time and for a cheaper price. I'm not going to say that it's less of a table hog. This still consumes lots of table real estate. You spread out all the different cards and it takes up a lot of space on your table. But it's really cool. It even comes with a neat solo variant where you kind of have an AI opponent, an automa opponent, if you will. And I feel that, you know, Stefan Feld doesn't really do solos very often in his board games. So it's so cool that he featured that in this game. So again, as a person who, as an ambassador of Castles of Burgundy, a person who can vouch for its greatness, I'll say that if you want to test or get a little preview of what Castles of Burgundy has to offer, this is a good way to invest into that world, but at the same time, perhaps not regret it because you spent more money or occupied more shelf space. My number 7 cheap board game of all time, Castles of Burgundy, the card game. And now we move on to my number 6. And my number 6 is the Ganshan Clever games. Any one of them. I own Twice as Clever and Ganshan Clever. I have not played Clever Cubed, which is the 3rd iteration in the series. But these games are phenomenal. And although I like all the twists and additional elements that are added to the Twice as Clever version of this game, the original rendition here, Ganshan Clever, is still as lovely and brilliant as it ever was. I have not lost any interest in it because I played it. It just seems like a standalone expansion of sorts where I pick and choose which one I want to play at any given time. This game plays so well at multiplayer competitively. It plays very well solo because even though it has a beat your own score type of condition, which I usually don't like, at the same time, the immersiveness, the mental immersiveness that it takes to really map out your decisions in this game really keeps me interested, and I'm okay with challenging myself in this game and trying to outdo myself from the previous play, which is not typical for me in solo board games. This game, very cheap, very economical. It's a roll and write game, but at the same time abstracted. It's not as thematic as some of these roll and write games tend to be. And I'd say it's a medium to heavy roll and write game. It's not heavy, but it's heavier than your typical roll and write games because typically speaking, roll and write games are pretty gateway and easy to learn. Yeah, this is a fun game if you're interested in abstracted roll and write games with that pack a challenge that are a little bit of a brain burner. This is a game you want to consider. Either one, Ganshan Clever or Twice as Clever. Doppelt so clever. My number 6 cheap board game of all time, Ganshan Clever. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. These are the best games for you to purchase if you're looking for cheap, economical games. And my number 5 is One Deck Dungeon. And I've talked about this a lot on the channel. I really like this game. This game is exactly what the title says. It is a dungeon crawl, fantasy themed adventure game, all compacted into one deck of cards. And the deck of cards, you're going to place them face down, representing the different doors, the different pathways into your dungeon. You're always going to have at most 4 dungeon rooms available. You're going to flip them over, see what's behind it. It could be some type of peril, some type of challenge you need to overcome, or perhaps it's a really big, bad, ugly monster like this ogre here. And you're rolling these different color-coded dice depending on your different skills and attributes. And the attributes on your player character sheet determine how many of the particular dice you're going to roll of which color. And you're going to roll them, and you're going to try to accomplish certain numbers here. It's a little bit of a dice placement game because you're trying to cover these spots here in order to defeat these monsters. And whichever spots you don't cover, they usually have some type of consequence, some casualty that the hero or heroes will suffer if they're unable to cover it. So you want to cover as many of them as possible in order to survive and last throughout the game. And you keep on going through this deck 3 times, each time descending deeper into the dungeon. And finally, after the 3rd time, if you're still alive to tell the story, you're going to engage in combat with the Overlord, the big boss of the game. And the game comes with 5 different Overlords, each with their own unique dungeons that add different challenges and twists and dangers to the players playing. Now, if you buy the base game, you can play 1 to 2 players cooperatively. You can buy an additional set in order to play this game at 3 or 4 players. But I find that this game is best at a solo game. I find it to just be, it sings to me at solo, just playing alone. I feel like it was meant to be a solo game. Now, this game does come with a Shadows of the Forest, I believe, expansion to add additional characters and content. And I believe there was an announcement of additional content, perhaps even a release of additional content recently for One Deck Dungeon. It's hard to keep track with that. But this game right here, even just the base game alone, for a real cheap price, around 20 bucks, just packs a big bite, a big punch, lots of cool little neat things. And you're just not going to get tired of it for how small and for how cheap this game is. It really delivers. My number 5 cheap board game of all time, One Deck Dungeon. And now we move on to my number 4. And this is the smallest box of them all. I'm not so sure if it's the cheapest one of them all, but it might just be. And that is Oh My Goods, designed by Alexander Pfister. And this game here, while I mentioned that it's the smallest box, it has got to be the heaviest game in weight and complexity. And I'm not saying that this game is overly complex. I'm not saying this game is overly heavy. But when you look at this small deck of cards, you'd be surprised at the end of the game how much this tested you, how much this really tested your mettle. Because my wife, that was her experience. We played the first game, and it was such an unassuming game based on the components, just a bunch of cards. And she was so utterly surprised with how challenging the game was. And it's really cool. It's really neat because players are manipulating this worker. Every player has this worker. And every player starts with a basic production building. And you're trying to produce from these buildings, these production buildings. But in order to do so, you need to either turn in the necessary resource cards from your current hand, or when the market cards get revealed, you need to be lucky enough for the resources you need to actually come out. And there's a little bit of a press your luck game here, because sometimes at the beginning of the round, you're deciding, do I want to go all out and be efficient with my worker? Therefore, if I'm being efficient, I'm going to need all of the resources that are required for that production building. But as I flip over the market cards, it turns out I fell short. I didn't have enough, and I'm not going to produce at all. Do I want to take that risk in order to produce a little bit more, twice as much? I'll get to produce 2 cards for the production building that I trigger. Or am I willing to work sloppily, where the game will grant me some mercy, and I only need all the resources put 1. I could afford to be 1 resource shy of the requirement in order to produce. However, I'm only going to produce 1 time from that building instead of the typical 2. So that's really the core and the heart of the game, making that decision. Along the way, you're using your cards as a multi-use card game where your cards represent your buildings. They represent your resources that you're using to construct other buildings. Your cards are also your money. So again, multi-use card games are your money, they're your buildings, and they're also your resources in your hand that you're using to build particular buildings. Really cool game, really fun to play. It doesn't take too long for how weighty it is. The estimated time on this game, according to the back of the box, is only 30 minutes. My number 4 cheap board game, Oh My Goods. And now we move on to my number 4 cheap board game of all time, and that is Port Royal, also designed by Alexander Pfister, who designed Oh My Goods. Alexander Pfister is known for his large board games like Great Western Trail and Maracaibo and other big box games, Isle of Skye, but he really knows how to bring it for these small, compact games as well, and Port Royal is no exception. This is a pirate-themed press your luck game where players are simply flipping cards over on their turn and deciding whether or not they want to flip over another card, or do they want to hold it right there and gather whatever benefit they might, because there's a possibility of busting in this game. You're flipping over cards, and one of the cards you're looking for are different ship cards that are going to produce the money that you're going to need in order to pay for the different characters that are going to grant you the victory points, which are ultimately the objective of the game. However, the different ship cards each have a different banner representing different nations. You got blue, green, yellow, black. And whenever you flip a second ship of the same color within the same turn, you're done. You've busted, and whatever money you could have produced is gone. Whatever characters you could have purchased are gone as well, and you've lost your turn. So it's something to consider. There is a way of mitigating the luck as the game progresses. There's different characters that you can acquire, the captain, and different crew members that you can acquire that have sword symbols on them, and each of those sword symbols add strength to you, which you will be able to repel certain ships of a certain strength value. The weaker ships, at least, you'll be able to send them away. So sometimes when you get a second ship, you'll be able to send them away away and you won't suffer the casualties of busting. But figuring all this out is really, really cool. And it also comes with an expansion. There's actually 2 expansions. I've only played one. The first one adds the contracts, which first of all adds cooperative play as an option. But even from a competitive perspective, racing for those contracts is really neat because they're going to get you additional points. So it's an additional way of scoring. Not only are you trying to do what you're trying to do with a certain characters, but you're also trying to fulfill those contracts. Also, the contracts give you a little bit of sense of direction in the game as far as your strategy is concerned, because typically in this game, it's very reactionary, it's very tactical. You're reacting to what's on the table right then and there, missions that are available, characters that are available, and whatever's going to get you the most points right then and right there. However, with the contracts clearly visible from the beginning of the game, and you're going to have about 3 of them or 4 of them depending on the player count always available. With those contracts out there from the beginning of the game, you can start to determine, what am I aiming for? What money do I want? What particular characters I want? What do I want to do in order to accomplish these different contracts? And all of the contracts vary and differ drastically from one another. My number 4 or 3 cheap board game of all time, Port Royal. Now we move on to my number 2, and my number 2 is Magic the Gathering. And this game here, very popular game, that's been around forever. This game can be very expensive if you are very into the hobby. If you are a Magic the Gathering player, if you're a lifestyle Magic the Gathering player and that's the game that you play, and you're involved in tournaments and you're really into the collectible scene there, this can be a very expensive venture. However, if you want to play Magic the Gathering casually, simply as a game that you have as part of your larger collection, there are very cheap and affordable ways of getting into it. Namely, these dual decks that combine 2 different asymmetric pre-made decks that are ready and balanced to play against one another. I find that to be really, really cool. And again, very affordable. All of a sudden, you buy a couple of these dual decks and you can mix and match and have different factions face one another. And Magic the Gathering is just, it's such a cool, such a fun game. I'll probably never get involved in the tournament scene. I'm not very good at it. I lose quite often when I do play at it. And I'm definitely not too interested in getting involved into the collectible scene either, because as you can see, I have another addiction that I'm working on. So for now, as I want to play Magic the Gathering, every so often I buy myself one of these dual deck packs at an affordable price, and it comes with a whole bunch of new cards, a whole bunch of new land cards and creature cards to mix and match and play to your heart's content. My number 2 cheap board game, Magic the Gathering. And now we move on to the top 1, the number 1 cheap board game, and it's really a series of games, and it's the Tiny Epic games. And I am a big fan of the Tiny Epic series, and in particular, I'm a big fan of the fact that so many of these games are good. I'm not a big fan of all of these Tiny Epic games. For example, I'm not a big fan of the original. I'm not a big fan of Tiny Epic Kingdoms. Tiny Epic Kingdoms falls flat for me. But most of the other titles that I've played are very highly enjoyable. And these are perhaps my 2 favorite, Tiny Epic Galaxies and Tiny Epic Western. Space exploration theme, Western, Old West theme. Really cool. They both play radically different. And that's the thing about Scott Almes. Although there is some overlap in his design philosophy, he goes out of his way to make each of the games feel different from one another. Now, he does revisit the fantasy genre time and time again. We have Tiny Epic Quest, Tiny Epic Defenders, Tiny Epic Tactics, and now the recently released Tiny Epic Dungeons. But he also explores other universes as well. He has Tiny Epic Dinosaur, again, Tiny Epic Western, space exploration here with Tiny Epic Galaxy. We have Tiny Epic Mechs, Tiny Epic Pirates. So he explores all these other genres as well. And these games just play phenomenally. They typically play very well solo. Some games play better solo than others. And they typically offer lots of different ways of playing the game with different artificial intelligences or different modes of playing the game. So even though you get this small box usually, or all the time you get this small box, you really get a lot packed into it because there's so much gameplay and so much variability from game to game that you're never going to get burned out from any individual game. And when you collect a pile of them, all of a sudden you have tons and tons of options. As a matter of fact, it's a real quick and cheap economical way to start your board game collection if you're seeking to do so. Just buy 15, or I don't think there's 15 yet, buy the 10 or so Tiny Epic games, and right then and there you're gonna have 10 games that you're gonna be able to invest lots of time into at a very, very affordable price. And that's it. My number one cheap board game of all time, Tiny Epic, or the entire Tiny Epic series. And that's it for today's video, folks. Thank you for joining us here when Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what's your favorite cheap board game. Which game are you surprised I did not mention or you would like to recommend to me? Also, tell me if you think any of these games here do not qualify as a cheap board game. I will gladly listen to your feedback, and I'm okay with being corrected as far as that's concerned. All right. Thank you so much for joining us here, guys. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.